Long days, pleasant nights, and welcome to Kingslingers, a Doof Media podcast journeying through Stephen King's Dark Tower series. As always, I am your host, constant reader Scott Daly.
And I'm relative King newbie Matt Freeman.
Yeah, when do we actually just get to say, we've joked about it the last few weeks, but like...
Yeah, I've only read 9 of his books, Scott, so I guess I'm a newbie.
I mean, the problem is, it's more than just a label. Like, it's a descriptor of what the format of the show is. And I feel like if I change that, it ruins things.
This is a very meta conversation, just like the conversation about this book we're about to have.
Boom! This week on the show, we are doing a Ka-tet victory lap as we begin the 8th book in the series, which is technically book 4.5. We're talking about the Wind Through the Keyhole. It's a new book week, Matt. It's been a while since we've gotten to talk about a new book, but here we are.
And I'm so happy we get to talk about this one.
Yeah. We will be discussing Section 1, The Starkblast, and Section 2, The Skin Man, Part 1 this week. In this novel, after the encounter with Randall Flagg in the Emerald Palace, Roland and his Ka-tet get caught in a storm, and Roland decides to tell a story of his youth. We then jump back to young Roland trying to solve the mystery of the Skin Man. So we just really got rolling with this book this week. And Matt, what do you think of it so far? What's your overall thoughts?
It's super awesome. I mean, I guess I just have to say how happy I am to be back in the Dark Tower after it, ended. It's like this is a delightful gift that Stephen King has given us. And so far, the book is kind of a fun combination of more of the good Dark Tower stuff, but also fun sort of new angle on things. Like, I think one thing we're going to talk about a lot is the fact that this is basically a sort of pastiche of detective and horror genres, which are two things that were not really in the Dark Tower. So that's cool and that's fun, and I'm going to have fun talking about that.
Yeah, I can't wait. This is a book that I don't remember that well. I said I've done 4 trips to the Tower. I don't always read this one on all 4 of those. So I think this is maybe the second time I've read this book. So it's kind of exciting for me.
Cool.
So let's just jump right into it. How about that?
Sounds good.
Before we do that, though, just a real quick reminder. Last week, kind of in the middle of the episode, in the middle of our mailbag, we announced what shows, or what books rather, we're going to be covering as part of our season 2 of the show. I'm not going to repeat all those here, but I am going to tell you, if you're curious, if you skipped our mailbag or you missed it or you were zoning out in the middle of that conversation, and you want to see not only what books we're covering, but how the breakdown's going to go, how we're breaking down the different sections of the books, you can head to our show schedule, which is linked in every single show note for every single episode since the beginning of the show. It's all there, and you'll see a separate tab for season 2 schedule, and you can see the breakdown right there if you were curious. So that's the only announcement I had this week, unless you have something else to announce, Matt.
No, we're good.
It's new Stephen King book day. We're recording this on Tuesday, and Stephen King's new book Later just came out, which is fun.
Very cool. Yeah, so I've seen that popping up in a few places, and I sort of generally avoid finding things out because I figure we might do something about them someday, so I have no idea what that's about. But I think that it's cool. It's cool that there's a new Stephen King book. So it's always a fun day, and we get 2 of them this year. He's going to have another book coming out in the fall. So fun times. Yeah, awesome.
All right, let's waste no time and dive into the Wind Through the Keyhole. So as we always do on our first book episodes, Matt, we have to talk about this book overall a little bit before we get into the nitty gritty. The Wind Through the Keyhole was released in 2012, 9 years after the conclusion of the Dark Tower series. And of course, in between these these 2 books, The Dark Tower and The Wind Through the Keyhole, Stephen King only wrote 6 novels, including The Colorado Kid, Cell, Lacey's Story, Doohickey, Under the Dome, and 11/22/63. He also wrote the novel Blaze, written under the Bachman pseudonym, and released a short story collection called Just After Sunset and a 4 novella collection called Full Dark, No Stars. So once again, he's just not doing much, just kind of sitting on his hands.
I like how the Bachman label is just his other studio label for why is Blaze under the Bachman pseudonym? I have to ask.
That's a good question. I don't want to spoil that book, but he tends to go back to the Bachman pseudonym when he's doing something interesting. Like in the 90s, he went back to Richard Bachman for his whole The Regulators Desperation link up. These are two books released at about the same time whose covers match each other. And actually not the stories, well, kind of the characters between both the books are the same, or their names are the same. At least they're slightly different characters. He's just having a lot of fun.
Okay, that sounds fun.
So I guess we should say right here that 9 years is the longest amount of time since there was a Dark Tower book. Even throughout all 7 of the original books, no one ever had to wait as long as 9 years. And then he finished the series, and then 9 years later, he comes out with this new book, which also, I just want you to know, happens to be the same amount of time as right now, right? So 2012 to 2021, it's been 9 years since we had another Dark Tower book. So we're due one any moment now, Stephen. Moment.
That's how that works.
But the thing I just wanted to say about that is we have to be asking ourselves this question as we read the story. And I don't think we have an answer yet, but I want us to both keep this in mind as we go through this week and next week and all the weeks to come. Why did King decide to come back? Right? Like, he finished the series. The Dark Tower series was his literal Dark Tower, and he almost died, and then he finished it. And then almost a decade later, he finds himself coming back to it again. So why did he do that? What more did he have to say that he thought, I really need to come back to the series and say something else? What more did he have to say about our protagonist, Roland Deschain? And I think that's going to be very important to keep in mind as we go through this story.
Yeah, right. Instead of answering that now, I think we'll just have plenty to say as we go through. I mean, even today, I think there's a lot of little things that I noticed where I'm like, I wonder if this is something where he just felt like he had to get this off his chest.
Yeah. The other thing we have to mention here is that we are technically doing this book, quote unquote, out of order. It's placed between books 4 and 5 chronologically, and King himself has said we should consider this book 4.5, but we didn't. and as we begin, I want to note that we'll be talking about why specifically I elected to not put this book right after Wizard and Glass. We've kind of already talked around it, but as we actually get into the book proper, I think the reasons why become more and more apparent, in my opinion.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'm really happy to leave it for the end. First of all, I think there are a lot of moments in here that work better as fun callbacks than they do as foreshadowing. And we'll talk about some of those as we get to them. For example, the reference to Andy. I don't think that works very well as foreshadowing, but it works really well as like a haha. And then second of all, dang, do I miss these characters? Right. Even though, this week we only see our Ka-tet briefly, we do indeed see them. And it made me very happy after the way everything kind of, ended in the main series.
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, regardless of what Stephen King says, this book was written in mind of a person who's read all 7 books already, right? It's written from the perspective, and Stephen King in the foreword of the book says you don't have to read The Dark Tower to read this book. You do not have to have read those 7 books, but he clearly wrote this book from the perspective of someone who has read the Dark Tower series already. And so, yeah, there's little Easter eggs, there's references, there's things that take on a kind of dramatic irony. There's all these moments that I think work better at the end instead of in the middle.
I agree.
And I think just emotionally, you're absolutely right. The act of reading this book as a person who read these stories before this book came out, this was like getting to come home. This was like returning home. And after the brutal ending of the final book, it's nice to give yourself a little bit of a reward to be like, oh, look, they're there again. They're there.
And it also kind of feels like the period of time just before Wolves was like the last moment before horrible shit started happening, basically.
Sure. Yeah.
So this, this is Jake pre most of his horrible trauma. Which is pleasant. It's pleasant to be reminded of this version of these characters.
Yeah. And it's really, I think at this point, Susanna knows she's pregnant, but we haven't really gotten to understand the full scope of that. There's like one throwaway line to her having this weird desire to eat rotting things. And that's all we really deal with her pregnancy so far. So that's coming. We know it's coming, but it hasn't really taken over the narrative in a way. So yeah it's everything's going okay for our characters right now.
Yeah.
All right, so let's begin it. We start with part 1. It's not actually called part 1, but the sections in these books are broken up a little bit differently than the way King normally does it. In this first part, which is called Starkblast, we begin what is basically the framing narrative to the story. And as you already talked about, we are reunited with our Ka-tet. Eddie, Jake, and Oi are still alive. Susanna is still in love and getting to hang out with her husband. Roland has yet to completely damn himself all over again. And I think, as you were saying, there's a lot of this very early part of the book, these first few pages, that just feels like reunion. Eddie is cracking jokes. Oi is spinning around in circles and doing goofy stuff. Susanna is letting just a little bit of Dead Walker slip out. And Roland is keeping secrets from his family. It's just like the good old days, Matt.
Uh-huh. Yep. Absolutely. I mean, it is funny how... I mean, I guess I have to kind of reiterate like how different wolves would feel if we had already established this pattern of Roland hiding things from his Ka-tet before we got into wolves. Like that would have really kind of rearranged the order in which we got that information and how we felt about it, I think.
Yeah. I mean, there's this part very, very early in the book where it says, I don't know, Roland thought of adding that he was sure something else was on Oi's strange little bumbler mind and decided not to. The gunslinger had spent long years with no Ka-tet, and keeping his own counsel had become a habit, one he would have to break if the Tet was to remain strong, but not now, not this morning. And this is exactly what you're talking about here, where this plays so much differently if you know the plot of Wolves of the Calla versus if you don't. And I think it plays better having known exactly that this very thing he's thinking about in this moment is going to become a major narrative movement of the first part of that book.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it drives me crazy to see him doing it again, at least in part because I'm pretty sure that he never actually learned his lesson by the end of the series. So you're just like, God damn it, Roland.
Yeah.
At the risk of repeating a point that I've made a few times in this show, I think what makes the Dark Tower so unusual is that it cruelly and intentionally denies us the catharsis that we kind of anticipate that we think we're due for, and makes very clear what Roland's flaws are. And then instead of giving him that moment of redemption and where he rises above his flaws, which is sort of where you think the story is going, the story damns him because he fails to recognize the flaws as such. And so on a reread, when you're confronted with the flaws again, you're just like, which, I mean, this isn't a reread for me, but it kind of feels like a reread because I'm seeing retro Roland. So. Yeah,
no, I get that. And I think that's part of the fun of this book, which is, in my opinion, another reason why we should be reading it in this order. But to talk about the story itself, the story begins with Jake kind of ranging further and further away from the group, exploring on his own. As a young boy who has survived some traumatic ordeals, but nothing compared to what's coming, this kind of makes sense. He's pushing himself. He's being more independent. And I love these early moments of the Tet being a little worried about this. Susanna's a little worried about him. And I love this exchange here. Do you find it worrisome, Susanna of New York? Roland asked. Yes, Roland of Gilead, I find it worrisome. She smiled amiably enough, but in her eyes, the old mean light sparkled. That was the Dead Walker part of her, Roland reckoned. It would never be completely gone. And he wasn't sorry. Without that strange woman she had once been still buried in her heart like a chip of ice, she would have only been a handsome black woman with no legs below the knees. With Detta on board, she was a person to be reckoned with. A dangerous one. A gunslinger. I think this is really interesting. It's one of those things that I love paying attention to in series where King is like cleverly recapping things and reminding you of things. Like it's possible it's been 9 years since you read the story and you forgot some stuff. It's also possible this is the first book you're picking up for whatever reason. So it's summarizing. It's like, oh yeah, we're reminding you that Susanna has a Dead Walker part in her. But I don't think it's ever been textually stated that the specific thing that made Susanna a gunslinger is Detta. I mean, this is something you and I talked about a lot, but I don't know if the book has ever made that textual.
Yeah, it almost seems like this was something that King wanted to say more clearly than he had said, and he just kind of decided to take this opportunity to do so.
Sure, makes sense. We also learn that Oi is behaving strangely, sniffing the air and looking behind them. It reminds Roland of something he can't quite place yet. We eventually see that this is the Starkblast, but this is where we get our moment of Roland deciding to keep things to himself again. But another role for Oi in the Ka-tet here.
Yeah, right. It's this little Billy Bumbler superpower, actually.
Yeah, and it gives us a little bit more knowledge about their role in society generally.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Eventually, the group gets to a river where they find Jake sitting on a river ferry with the old ferryman. And I pulled this part out because Susanna looks at the river and says, "Is that the why?" Susanna asked Roland. Yar. Eddie grinned. "You say why? I say why not." I just missed him so much.
Yeah. He really, I mean, he brings something to the book so that you really feel the absence of when it's gone.
Definitely.
It's funny because in my brain, Eddie has been gone forever. It's like, well, he was like the second half of the last book, basically.
Yeah, but that was like 2 months ago.
Yeah, I know.
If
hundreds of pages.
Yeah. So I also really liked this part. Susanna sees Oi kind of hanging out on the ferry, and she calls him. Susanna cupped her hands around her mouth. Oi, to me, sugar, come see your mama. Uttering shrill yips that were the closest he could get to barks, Oi flew across the raft, disappearing into the barn-like structure, then emerged on their side. He came charging up the path with his ears lowered against his skull and his gold-ringed eyes bright. "Slow down, Shug, you're going to give yourself a heart attack," Susanna shouted, laughing. Now, I don't know if this was just me, but this immediately reminded me of the time immediately after Jake's death when Susanna and Roland and Oi were all reunited in Fedek, and she calls him over and he like sprints across the distance between them and leaps on her. And there's this beautiful moment punctuated by her saying like, "You're liable to kill me," and which reminds them of Jake's death, and they're both brokenhearted. It's like it's basically the same beats playing again.
Right. Instead of you're going to kill me, it's you're going to give yourself a heart attack. Yeah, no, I think you're right. It's very visually similar. It feels very similar, except it sort of means the exact opposite because they're actually, no one's in danger. This is all just happy.
Oh, yeah. I think this is a lot of what King is doing here is hitting beats that are familiar to us, but kind of lacing them with just happiness, with just like the early moments of a family still just getting to be around each other and enjoying life around each other. And like part of me thinks this is what you could have had, Roland, if you cried off, like this is your life. This is existence with these people. It's hard sometimes, it's scary sometimes, but you're together. And I love it. I mean, I think part of me, like meta-wise, wonders if that's what King feels when he sits down to write these characters again.
Yeah, probably. I mean, I think maybe part of him did just kind of miss the Dark Tower, and he was like, I just want to revisit the Dark Tower. And then he's like, well, okay, what should I do? And maybe part of him is like, if I do revisit the Dark Tower, I don't want to torture those characters anymore. I want them all to be happy because they've been through enough, damn it. I don't know if this was actually the way he thought about it, but it's possible.
Yeah. So we meet the ferryman, who is a man named Bix, who agrees to take the Ka-tet across the river and further on their quest in exchange for the story of what happened to poor old Lud. And they don't have good news for him at all.
Yep.
I love once again, kind of, there's a lot of this that I think is intentionally hitting story beats of the previous books as a reminder. I mean, what's your thought on that? Like, do you think King is intentionally like trying to refresh our memories of some of this stuff?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, the fact that we, left Lud, it wasn't a book. It was 2 books ago, basically.
Yeah.
2.5.
Basically.
I think he really is just kind of taking the opportunity to be like, hey, let me just remind you of all of the main story beats of the Dark Tower. We've very, very rapidly too. I think that is what he's doing. I mean, I think he sort of did that in a more subtle and restrained way at the beginning of all of the books, actually.
Sure.
But in this one, I think there's an awareness that so first of all, there's probably an awareness that the readers who are picking up this book don't really know what it means to say that this book falls between Wasteland or
Wizard and Glass and Wolves of the Cow.
Wolves, yeah, right. Because it's like if you said that, I'll bet money that if you said that to me 10 years from now, if you're like, oh yeah, it falls between Wizarding Glass and Wolves of the Call, I would be like, and that means that the last thing that happened was, so like he's situating you in space and time. He's reminding you, okay, this is after the blood stuff and after the Blaine stuff and after the Emerald City stuff, but it's before the wolves. It's before the wolves stuff. Like if the Andy reference that's coming up has a purpose other than being, a cutesy thing, it's to say they haven't met Andy yet. Okay,
sure,
that's where we are.
Yeah, I mean, I know in the past King has complimented Harry Potter on its ability to like very quickly like remind the reader about what happened in the books before it, and so like I think he's kind of, J.K. Rowling aside, right? Let's put all that aside real quick. He has publicly, and I think he did this in On Writing. Actually, I read it recently, and I seem to remember him saying like it. He enjoys those books generally, but like what he really liked about them was the ability for each book to kind of place you and summarize you and catch you up. Assuming, if you're not someone that reads them obsessively, like not all the Dark Tower readers, believe it or not, read it like we do and like our listeners do. They might just casually pick these books up 10 years apart from each other, 5 years apart from each other, or 300 books apart from each other, depending. So there is some work that has to be done in that front. And I think he's doing it very casually, but with talent, I think.
Yeah, I agree.
I think it's interesting that like throughout this quest, we've encountered people that like Roland and crew just run into people that are just like living their lives in the what's remaining of this world and are just having to be told about the destruction that the Ka-tet has left in their wake. Like, I think that's something we talked about way back in Wizard and Glass, that it seems like these guys roll up into a town and then leave it destroyed. And I mean, that doesn't necessarily happen with old Bix here, but also we get this not explicit, but kind of implied concern that he's this old man who maybe didn't make it across the river in time before the Starkblast came, and maybe now he's dead too.
Yeah. No, I think maybe that is a valid thing to be worried about at this point.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it's interesting. He belongs to the subgroup of basically loners living in Midworld, which I would say, people like Brown actually qualify as.
No, I agree with that. Yeah. And serve the same purpose where they just really come there. They encourage the group to remember something or to say something. I don't think we tell a story to Bix specifically, but Bix is kind of the reason why Roland remembers the story. So they just kind of come into the Ka-tet's life and then move on. And are they dead? Maybe.
Right. Yeah, I mean, interestingly, there is another similarity to Brown, is that Brown is the one who prompts the tale out of Roland about Tull.
Yeah, that's true.
So there's a kind of very mild parallel there.
Yeah, I wonder, I mean, we can make like a thing about storytelling there, that really the desire to tell stories has to be brought to the storyteller, right? That like just Roland to just start the story on his own wouldn't be as realistic. Like we talked about this a lot back in the Gunslinger, that Brown kind of prompted this story. And I think all the stories Roland has told have been prompted by other people. And that indeed happens here too. It's Jake asking to tell the story of the Skin Man. And then within that story, it's little Bill asking him to tell him a different story. And he elects to tell him the Wind Through the Keyhole. So
yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
So as they're crossing the river, Bix finally states that Oi's weird behavior indicates that he knows it's coming. And Roland finally remembers what he was struggling to remember the whole time. And I love this line here. For a moment, Roland could say nothing. A clear memory rose from the back of his mind to the front, one of a dozen hand-colored woodcut illustrations in an old and well-loved book. 6 bumblers sitting on a fallen tree in the forest beneath a crescent moon, all with their snouts raised. That volume, Magic Tales of the Eld, he had loved above all others when he had been but a small one, listening to his mother as she read him to sleep in his high tower bedroom, while an autumn gale sang its lonely song outside, calling down winter. The Wind Through the Keyhole was the name of the story that went with the picture, and it had been both terrible and wonderful. And so I love that, because we're going to talk about this many times throughout the rest of this episode, but this is kind of our first indication that a lot of what's happening here revolves around Roland's mother, right? Like this, every path to these stories kind of goes through a memory of Roland's mother.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think so much of it, is loaded in the front of this book that I feel like this is the course of exploring Roland's, unresolved trauma with his mother's death.
Absolutely.
And like that's what this book is for, actually.
Yeah, 100%. And so it turns out that Billy Bumpers, or Thraken, as they're called in the old stories, have a special talent to recognize the coming of the Starkblast, which is this freezing cold storm. It's basically what happened in Texas a couple weeks ago. And it's the day after tomorrow, right? I mean, it's the day after tomorrow. I love how Roland has just kind of forgotten about this. Like it's not just me saying this. I think Bix seems surprised, considering he's an in-worlder, that he's forgotten about the Billy Bumblers and their ability to predict the incoming Starkblast. I mean, we'll learn a little bit later from Roland that Starkblasts are things that would happen like once or twice a year. So pretty frequent storms in the world of in-world before it moved on. And it seems like they were quite a problem. They killed quite a few people. Roland remembers seeing the carts full of dead farmers being carted. So I think it's an interesting commentary on Roland a little bit here, that he's kind of forgotten about this, and maybe a little bit about his privilege as, the high class version of life back in this old time. He was the son of the king, basically, and he lived in the castle. And we're told specifically that Gilead, this magical place, quite literally this magical place, was immune to the Starkblast. They would die out before they would get to Gilead itself.
Yeah.
And so he's just never had to deal with this thing as one of the facts of life. His only window into what these things are is through stories.
Yeah, if anything, he is kind of romantic about it. He's romantic about the wind. He thinks the wind is great. He lived in this tower. I once again have to point out that he grew up. His bedroom was in a tall tower with a rainbow colored stained glass window. Which is how his story begins and ends, is in a tower with a window. And he loved the sound of the wind sighing outside of his tower, right? And for people outside of the tower, that wind wasn't necessarily this happy thing, right?
Yeah,
just says something about his different attitude toward these things, one way or the other.
Mm-hmm.
Another
totally
thing,
agree.
I was wondering if like the Starkblast is a consequence of the fact that they live on this flat world, and like the fluid dynamics lead there to be these giant ice storms. Is that what everybody else thought too, Scott? You had a thought? No.
No, Matt.
Okay.
I've never literally considered the science of Starkblasts. I'm sorry.
The science of Starkblasts. That's a YouTube video.
There we go. So the group makes it across and they say goodbye to Bix, and Bix tells them, "We're well met along the path, are we not?" "So we are," Roland agreed. "And if you come back this way, stop and visit a while with old Bix. Tell him of your adventures." "We will," Susanna said, although she knew they would never be this way again. It was a thing they all knew. I really love this, Matt, because the thing about the Dark Tower is this has always been true. They've come across people. Those people have said, "Oh, when you come back this way, say hi." And the book has always been like, but they all knew they never would. Mm-hmm. It's always been true of this story. He's always peppered these ominous predictions in the story about this being a one-way trip, King has. But this one hits different, because for the first time, we, the reader, having read this after reading the first 6 books, know that this is true 100%, that this is fact. This is not just a feeling our characters get. This is not just Ka working its ways. This is undeniable truth that this is going to be a one-way trip for them. We know. And so it just hits different. It lands different.
Yeah, it's just sad this time. Yeah. I agree with that completely.
Yeah. Bix also tells them to tell Andy to fuck off and stop asking him if he wants his fortune told, or his what's the term?
His horoscope.
Horoscope. Thank you.
Yeah.
And I don't know how I feel about this, Matt. This is one of those moments where they just conveniently forgot that Bix told them about Andy when they actually go meet Andy. Right. And this is the kind of winking gag that it's the only time King does it in this section. And it's the only time that I think walks up to the line of ridiculousness a little bit here, because I just find it difficult to believe that they would have just totally forgotten this.
No, like I just don't. I feel like this is more of a thing where he's writing this with his readers in mind who have read all the Dark Tower books, and they're looking forward to this new Dark Tower book coming out. But it's been 9 years since the last one came out, and they've probably all forgotten about what happened when and what was in
Sure.
what book. And so just because he says this is book 4.5, even a diehard fan might be like, okay, but what does that mean? I don't really remember. And so he's saying, all right, so they just left the Crystal Palace, and Andy is the next thing that they're going to meet. That's the purpose of this. And it doesn't work at all if you read this after after Wizarding Glass and before Wolves of the Kala. You would just be confused and like, what? Huh? And
it would just be,
you'd probably forget about it.
It would just be a random thing that means nothing to you if you're reading them in that order. And in this order, it's one of those things where you're just stretching what you can get away with. Like, I can believe that in books, there's a reason why in books 5, 6, and 7, none of them ever talk about that time they got caught in the storm and Roland told his story. Like, that's fine, right? Like, that's just not a thing that's going to come up in casual conversation. But you start doing things like planting seeds this directly with your characters, and it just stretches the idea that they would have just all conveniently forgotten about this thing. And I mean, obviously the reason is because this book hadn't been written when that one was. So of course they can't have him react to something a character that hasn't been invented says. But I just feel like you got to work within the lane of trying to slot a story in between two already written stories. And this is just, King just went out of the lane a little bit with this one. And I didn't care for it, but it's a small thing. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I guess, I don't know. I guess I don't mind that much. Like I'm trying to reach for kind of the meta answer of if this is Scott, if this is the Dark Tower, which is being channeled through the beam into Stephen King from Gan's navel, maybe it was really important that there be this reference to Andy before they met Andy, and then they forgot about him, and it's just saying something really important. But I agree. It's just kind of like, I don't know.
That reminds me that this is something we kind of have to deal with, right? Is the meta nature of this story, because these books exist in a world in which Stephen King, Fred King, is writing them down.
Yeah.
And how does this book fall into that?
What does it mean?
Paradigm.
What does it mean that Fred King decided 9 years later, after he damned Roland to another cycle of the tower, that he had more to tell? Right. And when you think about it, doesn't that sort of give him unlimited power and freedom to just be like, and then here's the Dark Tower book 9 or whatever, where Roland wakes up from a dream and is startled and rolls over, and Eddie says, what's wrong, Roland? And he says, oh, I had this terrible dream where you all died.
It's Dallas all over again.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, he could do whatever he wants. I just think it's fun. Like, obviously within the real world perspective, King had an idea, and we talked about this at the beginning of the show, that King had an idea and there was a reason, and part of the fun of reading this book is kind of discovering the reason for why he wanted to come back and back to this world again. But within the universe, obviously Gan sang his song, and Fred King felt compelled once again to return, and there's not a clear-cut reason for that. And I mean, there's nothing in these 2 chapters that indicate anything to do with this meta narrative, and we'll continue to pay attention to it as we go through. But it's just something very interesting. Once you've introduced this concept to the world of your stories, even the one-off books you make 9 years later have to be examined under that lens.
Yeah, right. I don't think we're going to spend a ton of time using that lens, but it had to be mentioned because it was such an important part about how things wrapped up.
Absolutely. So one more thing here is, as they prepare for the coming Starkblast, Jake wants to know something. He asks Roland, how do the Bumblers know? Jake asks. Roland only shook his head. The how and why of things had never interested him much. This is such a wonderful Stephen King answer, and it's also just like perfect Roland. I think there's this idea that Roland and Stephen King are very similar people at times, and this is one of those things where, like, I wonder if this was an editor note, where it's just like someone was like, but Steven, how does that work? And he's like, I don't know. Yeah. And so that was how we changed it in the book, that
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. And the thing is, it doesn't matter. Just like the science of Starkblast doesn't matter either, Matt.
Right.
It doesn't matter.
Yeah, I mean, I enjoyed I enjoyed that exchange very much. I feel like this book actually turns up the dial on the Roland is slow meter by a couple of notches.
Yeah.
Particularly the young Roland stuff that we're about to get. But like, I mean, I think I think it's textual though. I don't think it's just like King is reminding us that Roland is a plotting character and that's his trait. I think it's actually more like Roland's head is not entirely in the game.
Yes.
Because we're about to see him make what I consider to be a kind of stupid mistake, which he then blames everyone but himself for. And I'll talk about what I mean when we get there. And that's the kind of thing where I'm just like, I think Roland right now in this scene and young Roland are both struggling with something that is interfering with their ability to function as gunslingers. We'll talk more about that when we get to that moment, though.
Yeah, no, I think you're spot on there. So I'm going to enjoy having that conversation.
Cool.
So the Ka-tet makes it to the town Bix told them about, and they start preparing for the incoming Starkblast. They get into the stone building, and as Susanna goes to check on the chimney, Matt, she manages to open the flue right on top of herself, and all the dust and ash fall down on top of herself. This part really jumped out at me because the extremely angry Susanna / Detta gets pissed off at herself and yells at herself and yells at the flue, and she cusses it out and she's screaming and cursing, and Jake hears that, and we get this part right here. In a tone of deepest respect, Jake said, "You know better swears than my father. I didn't think anyone knew better swears than my father." And it's just delightful.
Yeah. Yeah, there's something really endearing about Susanna doing such a human thing as accidentally dumping soot all over herself and then swearing a blue streak about it. It's totally the sort of thing that I would do.
Definitely.
And yeah, no, it's a great endearing moment with Jake. And I think this is one of the many beats that emphasizes, this is pre all the horrible shit, Jake, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, he's pre some of the horrible shit. He's gone through the horrible shit of dying.
Yeah.
Twice.
And the demon house. But
and the demon house.
But most of it is ahead of him, I would say.
This is pre the very traumatic incident of befriending someone and then witnessing your best friend slaughtered, and then, everything he goes to after this. And I think that is what this part is doing, right? I think it is endearing, but it is a reminder of just how young Jake is here. He is a child still. Like you said, this is before the Kala. This is before Benny, before, charging into a vampire den fully ready to die. Just like not only ready to die, but accepting and expecting death. Jake is a kid, and he's a kid who sees an adult swear and is kind of enamored by it. And I think that's what he's doing here, is he's kind of reminding us of what this version of Jake is and how young he is and how childish he is. And I think it's also because, this book is going to have at least one Jake aged character that we're going to see. So we need to level set our expectations. This is not the Jake that jumped in front of a van. He's not to that point yet. He's still innocently unprepared for that moment in his life.
Yeah, I think you're right on. I think the fact that, we are meant to parallel Jake's age with the age of the young boy in the story. That I think, and also to agree possibly with the fact that Roland in the story that he's about to tell is not that much older than Jake is now.
Yes.
We'll talk about that in a bit, I think.
Yeah. And I mean, no spoilers for next week, but we kind of have been told that the story, The Wind Through the Keyhole, involves a young boy. We don't know any details of it, but there's a young boy in that story who is going to be about the same age. So we're doing something here for sure.
Yeah.
The Starkblast comes quicker than they expected, and the Tet needs to scramble to get all the wood they need and get inside before things begin. At the last moment, Jake realizes Oy has been left outside, kind of awkwardly standing there awaiting the storm, so he runs out there to get him. And Roland, ever the concerned father, stops Eddie from going to help Jake. Eddie wants to go out there and make sure they're all going to be safe, and Roland says no. I love this because, and there's something I really wanted to talk to you for a while about on this, because there's no stakes here, right? We've read these books. We know Oi, Eddie, and Jake do not die in this moment. We know this. There's no stakes here. But I think the lack of stakes does something really interesting. It does a couple of things, actually, in my opinion. The first one is detached from all of this worry. Detached, like we, while reading this, are kind of casually just aware that even though this is a tense moment, nothing bad's going to happen to our characters. I think being detached from that allows us to kind of sit back and look at Roland's callousness in this moment in a different kind of way. And I think will not only is he callous, but he's doing the same things that his dad does. This is Roland, son of Stephen, student of court, and he's gonna turn this into a teaching opportunity. In fact, we see this kind of textually here. Once Jake and Oi are back inside safe, Roland chastises him and says, Oi was Jake's responsibility. He should have gotten him inside sooner, tied him to something if he had to. Or don't you think so, Jake? And so this is really interesting, right? He's so callous here.
Absolutely. Yes. So this to me was a moment where Roland felt kind of dumb to me because like, look at it reasonably. Like Oi is an extremely reliable animal, very obedient animal. It was very reasonable for Jake to just assume that if there was a problem, then he could just call to Oi, say, right. Okay, Oi, time to come inside. The storm's coming. He had no reason to expect that this would be the one time ever that Oi goes into Starkblast trance. And so like, it's not Jake that made the mistake. It's Roland that made the mistake, because shouldn't Roland have known, like, oh, by the way, Jake, Billy Bumblers go into a weird trance when the Starkblast is coming. So, beware of that, right? And then furthermore, it's if Jake is responsible for Oi, Roland is responsible for Jake, and so he's letting Jake run out into the storm, stopping Eddie from saving him, which was a great moment for me because Eddie's just like, fuck you, like there's this great conflict between them in that moment.
Yeah, I mean, it would be like if you bought a puppy for your son, and then your son took his puppy outside and it ran into the road and got hit by a car, and you were like, and that puppy was your responsibility, son. You didn't tie him up. You'd be like, I was supposed to tie. You didn't tell me that that's something I need to do. Like that's like never at any point in the relationship between Jake, Oi, and Roland has Roland ever said, hey, don't forget to tie up this bumbler because sometimes they don't listen when you call them. Like there's been no expectation of tying the thing up. They treat Oi as if he's a human being. They don't tie him up. They don't leash him. They've
never tied him up ever. Yeah. So it comes off as utterly ridiculous.
Yes.
It comes off as projection almost. Like Roland. I don't know. There's no real textual evidence that he knows that he screwed up here, but it feels kind of like he knows that he screwed up and he's projecting and being like, oh, you're the one who screwed up, Jake. I'm not the one who screwed up. Like I think it's all related to the fact that timeline wise, he's still reeling from just having had to kind of retell and rechannel first the story of Magus, and then I think more significantly the story of him killing his mother, which I think he has not processed. And I think that, I mean, my suspicion, my perhaps prediction is that this book is going to have more to do with him processing the fact that he shot his mom. And I think even back in Wizard and Glass, I don't think he really moved that, psychodynamic ball forward. I think it was just, he told them the story and then he cried about it and they were like, it wasn't your fault. He was like, yeah, it was. And then they moved on,
Yeah. I mean, I think you're definitely onto something here. I think it's not textual, but there does seem to be some amount of Roland having trouble dealing with his responsibility in everything that happened and detaching himself from that responsibility. And I mean, like, his responsibility for David, his responsibility for Court, his responsibility for Susan, and for Jake, and for his mother. Yeah, I mean, this is something that, like, he looks at Jake as a mini him in some ways, and he's saying, you need to take responsibility for this. You need to do that. And yeah, it is kind of ridiculous. And it makes me sad because Jake just internalizes it and is just like, yeah, you're right. I should have known better than to realize this quirk of Billy Bumblers that literally 5 minutes ago, I didn't know they even did this whole thing. And Roland has apparently known his entire life and just forgot until some random guy reminded him.
That's another. Yeah, exactly. Because like Roland forgetting about it in the first place is also him abdicating his responsibility, right? Like, like what if the Starkblast had come like an hour earlier and then just killed everyone? Like, well, that would be Roland's fault, because Roland had an ample opportunity to notice the Billy Bumbler acting weird and do something about it.
And the unnaturally warm temperature, the sound of the wind, these are all clues for Roland that he should have remembered and failed to. And yeah, you can't put any of his Ka-tet responsible for that, because they're not from here, Roland. They're from other places. Yeah,
I really like your dog running in the street analogy, because like every adult knows like dogs love to chase cars, and you know they don't understand the danger of it, and so you can imagine like letting a kid take a dog out into the front yard and like that would have been your chance as the adult to be like, by the way, dogs love to chase cars. Yeah, this is my responsibility to remember to tell you this. I like how that's a good analogy.
Yeah. The other thing that this made me think about, though, is, and this is kind of a tangent, but not really. I wonder how much of Roland's, like, what we perceive as Roland's monstrousness, what his callousness is him just living his life on some unconscious level, as if reading a story that he's already read before, right? Like that he's done this loop, he's done this many times, and maybe on some unconscious level, he knows what's going to happen. And so he's not worried about Jake, and he's okay using this as a test, because on some level he knows Jake doesn't die here. This isn't how Jake goes. That happens later. So it's a safe environment to test someone in his mind.
That's really interesting. Yeah. I of course wanted to take that to the metaphorical level. Because I mean, you know, perhaps this sort of thing, which really does pervade the entire Dark Tower series in small ways, serves as a warning to us that we should avoid living as if we ourselves are living in a story. And it may sound weird, like you may think like, what do you mean? I don't need to be reminded of that. But like, I actually think we all are prone to narrativizing our lives, you know, to kind of thinking of ourselves as the protagonist, to thinking of our enemies as antagonists, and to thinking of our challenges and tribulations as, you know, plot points and trials that we're basically destined to vanquish, because like, well, of course we're trained on stories. So of course, you know, everything's going to turn out right in the end. Cause that's just how it is. But like in real life, things are not destined to work out. You don't always get the catharsis. You don't always get the redemption. You don't always get the dramatic, repair of your broken relationship. It's you know, it's not guaranteed. Sometimes, you know, anytime there's a coincidence, it's probably just a coincidence and not Ka. And I don't know, like maybe I'm particularly bad about this, but like I think going from like age 20 to age 30 for me was like a series of instances of me learning like the world is not organized around me in any way, and if I make bad choices, then I get to suffer the consequences of those. And this is not a story, and this is not a plot, and I am not a character. If I'm a character, I'm a tertiary character, and somebody else is the protagonist.
Yep. Yeah, no, I love that so much. I think there's absolutely something to that. I mean, I think this is, we've said again and again and again, one of the major motifs of the Dark Tower is storytelling and the power of storytelling. And I think you can fit the theme of it is this incredible power the telling of stories is, but with great power comes great responsibility, right? And I mean, personally, I am a person that was raised on stories. Like, I've loved storytelling since I was a kid. I've been reading books and watching movies basically constantly since I was a child. And so my makeup and my understanding of how the world works is so heavily influenced by storytelling. And it can be bad. It can be bad. I certainly often think of myself as the protagonist of the world, and it is good to remind yourself that no, you're not. That's not how life works. Yeah,
because as Roland does here, he's behaving somewhat foolishly. In a way that if you're right, if he is somewhat subconsciously influenced by the fact that part of him knows that he's done all this before, well, that's not good. Like that's it's not good behavior. Yeah. Right.
I mean, like, think of what would happen if Jake died here, right? Like, Jake rushes, they both freeze to death. And then Eddie and Susanna are looking at Roland, and he's like, huh.
Guys.
I guess that was their role in my quest.
Yeah, now I learned a valuable lesson about not doing that specific thing.
Yeah. Oh my God. That's great. So they light the fire and they attempt to keep warm as the temperature drops and the wind begins. And I love this part. So no one can sleep because the wind is bringing bad dreams. And this is the first introduction of a concept that I think runs through this entire story, especially in these 2 chapters we're talking about this week, is this idea that Roland repeats at least 3 times, that he loves the sound of the wind, that everyone else kind of hates the sound of the wind blowing, and he loves it. He says here, it soothes his heart and reminds him of old times. And I think we kind of see that the old times he's specifically referring to here are when he was young, being raised by his mother, being told stories by his mother, being around his mother. And obviously this book is called The Wind Through the Keyhole. The fairy tale in the middle of the book is called The Wind Through the Keyhole. So wind plays a powerful role in this story. And I kind of love how King is laying the groundwork for that wind is this device of memory that Roland loves. Even, and it's interesting because it's all, I wonder if it's a way of remembering the good times without processing the bad times. I don't know. We'll have to think more on that.
Yeah, I think maybe. I mean, that's an interesting thought. Yeah, I mean, I like the idea of wind being like a wind that connects all these stories together.
Yeah.
Yeah. It also reminds me of Ka, like a wind, where, I mean, in this case, I think that's more than a coincidence. It's like the wind of Ka moves from Wind Through the Keyhole through his story he's telling into the present, and it also is this kind of symbol of his past, and maybe to a degree a symbol of his relationship with his mother.
Yeah,
I don't know. I'm sort of conflating the idea that he has all these these comforting, happy memories of living in his little kind of nursery tower, with the fact that his mom is in so many of those memories that maybe for him that's all kind of the same feeling of warm comfort and being cared for by a mother. If
there's one universal truth that goes throughout this entire series, it's that Roland has very complicated feelings towards his mother. Some of them very positive and loving memories of childhood, some of them weird and sexual, and some of them very, very sad and filled with grief and guilt. Yeah. And some
angry because, one of his last interactions with her was learning that she, quote unquote, betrayed his father and him. And
again, too, like she betrayed his father and then got caught and then was still doing it, apparently.
Yeah. And was gonna poison him, if I remember correctly.
We're led to believe that. So much of what was and wasn't true there is all kind of confused because of this evil witch rolling around in it. But
that's true. But now you're right. Now I don't clearly remember, but yeah, I mean the point is, and I actually think that like part of his processing of his grief is, knowing that he was so angry at her when he killed her, that maybe some part of him is afraid that he did it on purpose. Like, and I'm not saying Roland did it on purpose. I'm saying it's realistic that Roland would be afraid in his soul that he saw that it was Gabrielle for a fraction of a second and still pulled the trigger because of how angry he was at her. And maybe it's just a possibility, but if so, that might be something that we might see dealt with in this story.
Yeah, you're totally onto something there. 100%.
Cool.
All right, so let's begin the story. So no one's able to sleep, so they say, Roland, tell us a story. So he decides, thinking about the wind, thinking about the Thraken, and all that kind of stuff. Roland has just the tale for them, and he says, mayhap I'll tell you too, since it's long until dawn, and we can sleep tomorrow away if we like. These tales nest inside each other, yet the wind blows through both, which is a good thing. There's nothing like stories on a windy night when folks have found a warm place in a cold world. And I love that because that's our very, very classic Roland, very classic Stephen King to do this kind of nested storytelling structure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, love it.
And with that said, the story begins. And so we move on to the Skin Man Part 1. And the first thing, Matt, the big thing that we have to point out as we transition into this story within a story is that we're doing something that is entirely unique to this story in the Dark Tower. It's told in first person. This is the only time in these 8 novels that Stephen King has done this. The story of Roland testing the line against Court was not in first person. The story of Magus and Susan Delgado was not in first person. But here, King chooses to tell this story with I's and me's. And that's a really interesting choice, no?
Yeah, very much. It really reminds us kind of constantly and repeatedly that this is a story that Roland is telling. It really puts us in the room with the Ka-tet, and it also enables him to kind of make these very specific asides where he's like, I wouldn't find this out until later, or what have you.
Yeah. And it also does something really, really interesting to me, because when you hear that we're transitioning to first person, I think one of the first reactions you would have is, oh, we're going to get to learn a whole lot about Roland because we're going to be in his head in a direct way that we've never been in before. But that's not quite the truth here, right? Mm-hmm. Because Roland is crafting the story. He's deciding what words to say and what words not to say. This is not a traditional first person story in that it's just a person like talking to whoever. It's he's telling a story, he's crafting it. So there's actually a chance here for this to be more unreliable than the third person. That the third person can have Roland subconsciously think about something that he didn't realize, or a thought pops into his mind, and maybe Roland, if he was speaking this, would push that out of his mind because he didn't want to deal with it. But in this version, he can craft and avoid that. And that's really interesting because you get this situation where some of the most revealing things about Roland could be not what he says here, but what he does not say. Yeah,
no, I think you're exactly right there. It makes me want to pay a lot of attention to kind of the way he chooses to frame certain things, and what he chooses to focus on, and maybe what he chooses to not focus on.
Yep.
Because again, it's not Stephen King telling the story; it's Roland telling the story this time.
Yep. I love it. The story itself begins with Roland reminding us how he totally shot his mom, which is just a hell of a way to start a story. Mm-hmm. When did the story take place, my friends and family? That time that I killed my mom.
Yeah, which, I mean, just for the sake of saying it, I mean, that it really does kind of pick up very soon after the events of the story that he just finished telling in the previous book.
Yes.
Chronologically speaking, he's like, I shot my mom, really sad. And now he's like, now that we've settled in again, I'm going to basically continue that same story.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, like, at the end of this extremely traumatic event, now we're going to tell the story of the day after, the next day. What's that day going to be like? And of course, this is important. It's an important framing device because, as you've already kind of gestured to, and as you've hypothesized, this is a story that is very much circling around his mother and his relationship with his mother and him dealing with what happened there in a way that these books never really have. I mean, you talked about that a little earlier, but the Dark Tower, it definitely like was a major moment for Roland in book 4, but it was never picked up again from that point on, whether it be because of the huge break that King took between book 4 and book 5. I don't know. But we sat down in Wolves of the Calla and we don't really see a Roland that's dealing with the after effects of what he learned in that Emerald Tower.
Yeah. I think part of me was always kind of expecting that we would get some form of closure or catharsis surrounding the fact that he killed his mom. And maybe Stephen was also sitting there thinking the same thing and thought, okay, I'll just write that one.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the, I'm trying to think of the way the word to, I do think Roland gets a certain amount of catharsis in the ending of Wizard and Glass. I think the thing that the books fail to do, and that's maybe even too critical of a word, I think they fail to illustrate why that catharsis is important to Roland, like why that matters. It just didn't connect the dots to why dealing with this stuff with Susan and with his mother was absolutely key to his relationships with the Ka-tet that he has now. There's just a little bit of it. And I mean, it's kind of there. It's just, I think this book to me, at least at the beginning, always felt as a way to make the implied a little more explicit.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. It's always challenging to talk about this book in particular because the point of Roland is that he's a character who doesn't change. So for me to say I expected there to be a change, it's like, well, no, that was a wrong expectation. But I think we are maybe going to explore it a bit more in this book, is maybe a better way of saying it. But yeah, I mean, I felt at the end of Wizard and Glass like how I wanted to explore more, like what was the day after he shot his mom like.
Mm-hmm.
and this book basically answers that, right?
Sure. Yeah. All right, so the story is basically Roland is meeting with his father, and so we kind of start the book, the story within a story, with Roland walking into his father's room. And I love the tone setting moment here that this story is. The fireplace was a dead socket. He rarely called for it to be lit, even on the coldest days. So Roland walks into this room. We see his dad. He's still wearing his mourning gear. He's still mourning for the death of his wife. And what do we see immediately? That this room is cold. It's not warm in here. And so we have Stephen Deshane saying the right words to his son, right? Like saying, I don't blame you for what happened here. It was not your fault. You are not responsible for the death of your mother. You shouldn't feel that way. But even if that's true, that Stephen legitimately believes that, the atmosphere of the room is cold. There's no warmth here. There's no welcoming here. Does he even embrace his son in the scene? I don't think he.
No, I don't think so.
I don't think he does.
No,
Yeah,
he's too old to be embraced.
Sure.
Yeah. No, I mean it seems very Roland to disregard creature comforts this way. So
yeah,
I think a tremendous amount of this book is going to be paralleling Roland to Stephen Deshane.
Yeah, and, I mean we get to see Stephen in action for basically the first time.
And in that scene, we're sort of paralleling young Stephen with young Roland too, and showing what, like, how they were maybe more similar when they were kids, and now they're also, now that we know old Roland and this is old Stephen, we kind of see that they're similar as men as well.
Totally. So Stephen has called Roland in here because he's heard that Roland is nursing the dying Court, not just being by his side, but like changing his diapers and stuff. And Roland sees this or Stephen sees this as Roland attempting to do penance for what happened with his mother. And this is something that he calls unworthy of him. You are scourging yourself for the death of your mother, which was not your fault. Part of me knew this was true. Part of me refused to believe it. I think that ties into what you're talking about with Roland's responsibility that he feels for this whole thing, and the uncertainty with which he is dealing with his responsibility. Yeah,
it reminds me of the whole story beat of Steve of how Stephen thinks about morality, where he basically encouraged Roland to completely disregard any sort of conventional sense of morality, and I guess it reminds me of that here, because it's like, it seems like it would be good for Roland to take care of his sick and elderly and dying mentor. Like if this were any other story than The Dark Tower, then it would be a good thing for your young male protagonist to be showing the moral evolution of being somebody who's willing to change the diapers of their wise mentor. But Stephen is just like, nah, you got more important stuff to do. I need you to go kill the monster for me. Forget about your teacher. That's not important. That thing you did where you killed your mom and my wife, that wasn't your fault. Just put that behind you. Buck up, kid. Here's a gun. Totally. It's a very, I guess sometimes it really hits me how not any other fantasy novel The Dark Tower is. Yeah. I mean, I feel like Lord of the Rings, you'd want to show how kind and benevolent of a leader Aragorn is, and showing him change the diapers of one of the most important figures in his life would be a really quick and easy way to do that. It's kind of a save the cat moment, right? Like, look how kind, and especially since you could make the argument that Roland is somewhat responsible for the shape Court is in, because he really kicked his ass when he fought him. He left him blind in one eye, and like, it's not his fault that Court is dying. Court's an old man who's been through a lot, but he owns a piece of it at least. It's also really interesting that
I think Stephen's right here that Roland is doing this as a form of penance. But also to jump to that conclusion immediately is kind of funny, right? That like you can't for even a second think that he's just doing it because it's the right thing to do. No, he has to have some other ulterior motive connected to his guilt with his mother. And he's right, but that's just like a very cynical look at everything.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think this is a way in which Stephen knows that his son is like him. And he knows like, well, if I was wiping Court's ass, it would be because I felt bad and guilty. It wouldn't be because I'm just a good guy, because I'm not. No, that's cool.
Of course, Stephen makes very clear here that the real guilty party was, of course, Rhea of the Coos. He says it was she who killed your mother, Roland. She turned you into a gun and then pulled the trigger. And my response to this was kind of, I mean, if we want to get technical here, Stephen, you turned Roland into the gun. Like Rhea just took that gun that you loaded and pointed it at what she wanted instead of what you wanted. And I don't think this is me just saying this either, Matt. I think King is going for this because 2 pages previous to this moment, we have this thing that Stephen says while he's chastising Roland. He says, "Did I raise you to the gun so you could become an Ammy and nurse a broken old man?" So we've kind of connected this idea of Stephen raising him to the gun and then saying Rhea made him a gun. It was like, no. That's not quite how it worked, bud.
Right. We just had a scene where Roland basically abandoned all sense of proper responsibility and blamed Jake for something that Roland is probably more responsible for. And here we have Roland's father sort of abandoning all sense of responsibility and saying, it wasn't your fault, Roland. We're not even going to discuss the idea that it might be my fault. Yeah. It was the witch's fault. Yes, it was that scary woman's fault, which I think that's another recurring theme we're going to see in these first 2 chapters. This idea of scary women. Yeah. Women. Yep. Good point. Yeah. It's so interesting, right? I mean, it fascinates me how complicated the men of this family are with the women in their lives. Like Roland's relationship with women is so fucked up, entirely fucked up. Well, I mean, here you have Stephen who, he's wearing the mourning garb, but he doesn't seem to be at all upset about his wife being blown away by his son, no less. And I get that, their relationship was probably strained because not only was she cheating on him, but he was aware of it for a super long time. What we learned back then. But like, he's just not perturbed about it at all. And, as Roland standing there, this is his father, obviously not caring that his wife is dead, that Roland's mother is dead. I mean, that's also very upsetting for a kid, I think. So just everything about this is screwed up. I mean, and really, to go back to our framing device, that this is Roland telling a story. It's interesting that he doesn't even insert any commentary related to that here. Like, he doesn't even say, my father was putting on a brave face or showing a brave front, or but I could tell he was deeply hurting inside still. There's none of that either. I don't think he was. I don't think. I mean, I don't want to like judge the man for what he's keeping to himself, but I think there's something to. I mean, I think there's something to the fact that neither of these men are really, really dealing with it outside of whatever individual responsibility they have, which one is instructing the other to completely detach of. It's not your fault. Don't worry. It's really interesting. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. Maybe we'll find out differently, but my suspicion would be that he is not exactly terribly sad about his wife dying at this point. But I would hope he's like, it's a little more complicated than that, but I don't know. Yeah. I do think like he is, even though he's trying to tell his son that he's not responsible for it, again, like with the unlit fire, there's no warmth to that process. There's no like, come here, son. Like, I know what you're going through. I understand why you feel that way. It's just like, hey, stop it. Yeah. Stop it. It's like if you went to a therapist and you told the therapist your problems and they just looked at you and said, stop it. Right. Don't do that anymore. Oh, okay. Thanks. Yeah. I guess I just won't do it anymore. Yeah. Roland is a malfunctioning gun to him. Yeah. Yes. Oh, that's perfect. Yeah.
Regardless of all that, Stephen is sending Roland away on a quest again. He's going to Debaria, which also happens to be the location of that all-woman convent that the late Gabrielle Deschain went to repent for her infidelity, which I can tell you right here, Matt, is just not going to have anything to do with this story at all. Nothing at all. That It just happens to be that same place.
Yep. These definitely aren't themes.
Debaria has a problem with a skin man, a kind of shapeshifter, a kind of werewolf that's been killing and slaughtering people all over the countryside. So they need a gunslinger to go take care of that, and he's sending Roland. And he'll be joined by one of his friends again, but not Cuthbert or Elaine. No. This time, Matt, it's going to be Jamie DeCurry. And this is really interesting because I think Jamie Redhand was one of the characters that Roland kind of very constantly talks about as part of his original Ka-tet, right? And we learned a little bit about him here and there, but I wonder if like a decade removed from finishing the series, King was like, oh man, I have Roland think about this Jamie guy a lot, and I never actually let anyone see him. Oops. So let's make it this one.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I think you're right. And now that it's been 9 more years, maybe we'll get the epic of Desmond, the most important Ka-tet friend of Roland.
I can certainly hope so.
Yeah. So as we're moving into this, can I just say how happy I was to realize that in the tradition of Dark Tower stories always being pastiches of other genres, in this one we're getting a Western gunslinger / detective story / werewolf story.
It's a lot going on here, but it's all wonderful.
Yeah.
So we have Jamie DeCurry here, and he's an interesting guy, Matt. He's an interesting guy, almost in how uninteresting he is. As one of the first things we do here with Jamie is Roland, and therefore King, kind of paints Jamie in direct contrast to Roland's other friends. Like it's a very easy storytelling technique, right? Where you can just say, well, everyone understands who Cuthbert is. Everyone understands who Elaine is. So let me characterize Jamie by contrasting him with them. So we get this wonderful scene here. At a particularly hard jounce, Jamie was thrown right off his makeshift bed and onto the floor. Cuthbert would have laughed, and Elaine would have cursed, but Jamie Redhand only picked himself up, stretched out again, and went back to sleep. And that is Jamie.
Yeah. Very excited to kind of dig into Jamie and see, whether this first impression of him is fully accurate or whether there may be some more levels to him. I guess my first reaction is just, we've talked off and on about how all of Roland's Ka-tet members are either like a mirror of him or a facet of him or have some particular lesson for him in some way. And so basically all the characters around Roland can be said to be in his life for a purpose.
Yeah.
Or to be reflecting some aspect of him. And so the thing I noticed immediately about Jamie is that, well, Jamie has the plotting, sort of unthinking, unswerving nature more than any of the other Ka-tet members that we've seen. And maybe this is where we explore that particular facet of Roland.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, we're not going to see him get in trouble like with his mouth because the guy just doesn't talk very much.
Right.
We're not going to see him like they get to the convent and he's not going to go flirt with any of the women. Like he's just not that dude. He's kind of all business. Doesn't really want to do the small talk thing.
Yeah.
Just is the silent brooding type.
Right. Yeah. And Roland has that aspect to him. He just also has a romantic side, which remains to be seen whether Jamie has a secret romantic side. Well, I guess we'll see.
Yeah. I don't know. I think it is important to say that like Roland's father knows how close he is with both Cuthbert and Elaine. And so choosing Jamie here we see is intentional, that he knows his son would prefer those guys. And so he specifically decides not to send them.
Right.
So this is an important part of it.
Yeah.
So the train that they're taking out to the west derails, and Jamie and Roland are forced to go the rest of the way on horseback. And while they're kind of walking, Roland catches Jamie up on what his father had told him about the Skin Man. We basically learn that this thing has attacked several times around the area and just brutally murdered a ton of people. And it's always a different animal. Sometimes it looks like a big cat. One person describes a tiger, which is, I think the importance of that is Roland kind of says, nobody out here has ever seen a tiger before, but that's what they're describing. So that seems significant because it's not like a tiger is just going to be hanging out. So the evidence that this is a skin man is kind of stacking up. One of the other things is some of the witnesses see that it's standing upright. It's running on two legs, which is werewolfy. So certainly seems like skin man theory is correct here.
Yeah, I absolutely. And as we get into the skin man stuff, I guess I'll just preface all this conversation by saying, like, wow, this gets way more just brutal and awful and terrifying than I was expecting.
Yeah, King really leans into it, that's for sure. So the pair make their way down the road and eventually get to Serenity and meet Everlyn, the prioress of the organization and the biggest woman Roland has ever seen. She's compared within a single page to both Lord Perth and David Quick, which are like our midworld standby references for super giant people, which allows us to get the scale of her almost immediately. She's this large, tough, like take no prisoners badass woman who also seems very, very kind. I think they're playing off this kind of stereotypical Western marm character, maybe the owner of the brothel, like a woman that can own a brothel and survive in this world. I mean, this is not a brothel, but it's that archetype character they're playing off here. She's got a knife strapped to her hip and she's like, yeah, come on, skin man, you come at me again, I'll fucking cut you. Like she's a wonderful character and I love her. And this quote here that introduces us to her is particularly enjoyable. "You must eat is what you must do," she said. "We'll have it out here a roadside so your digestion will not be decomposed. For I know what stories they tell about us in Gilead. Aye, so do we all. Men tell the same about any woman who dare to live on their own, I wot. It makes them doubt the worth of their hammers." That's wonderful, right?
Yeah.
It's a perfect characterization moment. And I think it does something really interesting that we kind of gestured at earlier. These men are like terrified of these women, and like any woman of power in this world, the men's reaction, even some of the most strongest badass men like Stephen Deshane, is fear. Like Stephen tells Roland to watch out for these evil women. The conductor of the train says, "Oh, they're gonna eat you." It's just like ridiculous stories, and they're just like women being empowered in this world is terrifying.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good thing to point out, especially since, Roland's mother is going to, I think, play a role. I mean, at least her presence is going to play a role in the story. Something that's jumped into my mind, though, is kind of throwing me off, is the idea that, like, at the beginning of this book, Roland did kind of go out of his way to say the part of Susanna that makes her a gunslinger is Detta, which is the evil part. And it's like, is that true? Or is that just what Roland thinks? Because he can't, like, for him to accept a woman as a gunslinger, he has to believe that, like, well, she has this evil monster in her soul, and that's what makes her, that's what allows me to accept her as a gunslinger. Because it's not like we really see any evidence that Roland is any less sexist than anybody else in his culture, which is very sexist. But he seems to have no trouble accepting Susanna as a full-fledged gunslinger. So I don't know. I was just noticing that for the first time.
Yeah, I had never thought about it that way, but I like that a lot. That's really interesting. Cool.
Yeah.
So the ladies of Serenity were also attacked by the Skin Man, and one of their survivors, a horribly maimed survivor, tells the story of the attack. And I love this quote about that story here. That I think Everlyn is the one that says this. Everlyn. She says, "Horror is a worm that needs to be coughed out before it breeds." I just love that quote. It's so evocative.
I love this whole exchange. I love these characters. The horribly maimed nun, I guess. I don't know if that's really the right word, but it really sets a powerful, foreboding tone that kind of leads us on into the next part. Yeah, I mean, the fact that we use the word horror there, horror is a worm. I think that's intentional, because King is telling us, like, horror is what we're about to get into.
Yeah.
I think this book has a lot more horror than any of the other Dark Tower books, as far as I am concerned.
No, I think you're right there. Totally. So Roland and Jamie next head to the Debaria town proper and meet up with Hugh Peavy, the sheriff of these here parts.
Hugh Peavy. That's the best name ever.
It's such a good name. Sometimes King, he's just spot on with these names.
Yeah, you already love him, and you haven't even met him yet.
Mm-hmm. And I love this quote from Hugh Peavy. He says, "Yar, yar, I've heard your name and a bit of your exploits in Magus, for we get some news even out here. There's the dit-da wire and even a jing-jang," which is it's a telegraph and a phone.
That's great.
But I just love the names of these things. It's so fun.
It's delightful.
You couldn't just call it a phone, but like spelled wrong. No, it's a jing-jang.
No. Of
course it is, because what does it do when it rings? It jing-jangs.
Yeah. And they probably don't understand how it works, and or maybe even know where it comes from. Yeah.
No, they just know it does work.
I've always loved that. Like, I love the ice making machine in Magus, and there's a telephone here, but then there's the revolvers, but then it's basically a fantasy setting. Other than that, like, it's just endlessly fun.
It is. It really is. I love when he chooses to accentuate the weirdness of this world.
Yeah.
That just, oh yeah, also we have a telephone.
Right.
So Peavy asks Roland for proof that he is who he says he is, and Roland shows him a box that his father gave him. Inside the box is a dented slug. Peavy goes on to tell us the story of this bullet, a story of his encounter with Stephen Deshane when he was much younger, and how he helped dig this bullet out of Stephen's arm when he was shot. And we got to talk about this story for a while, Matt, because I think this is really sneakily important to what King is doing here. At first, here's how I want to set it up. We have this part here where Roland says, "I also knew that the story probably had nothing to do with our business, and I should have told him to move along. But my father never talked about his younger days, and I wanted to hear this tale. I was hungry to hear it. And it turned out to have a little more to do with our business in Debaria than I at first thought." I love this. This is such a fun way to get a character moment for Roland, but also still do King's trick of kind of hinting at something important to come. This story could just been a non sequitur bit of character moment that will pay off later, that we just don't know it'll pay off later until it does. And they'll be like, oh, cool, that was seemingly non sequitur, but then it paid off and it's fun. But no, King does his old standard thing where he makes it a non sequitur, but also tells us specifically it will 100% pay off in the future.
Yeah.
And he's using this conceit of campfire storytelling to do this thing. And it's really wonderful.
Yeah. Well, and it is really realistic too, because if you're telling a story, if you're sitting around the bar telling a story and you go on what appears to be a tangent, you kind of have to be like, all right, so first I have to explain this thing. It'll come into play later, I promise, because if you don't, then people are going to be like, this guy sucks at telling stories.
Yeah, sure.
Just goes on random tangents, and in real life you can't trust your audience to catch the thematic resonance across your story. You kind of have to make it obvious why something is relevant.
I think that's the fun thing he's doing, because I think in this moment he's doing double duty, where Roland is telling his audience that this will textually matter later in the story, and Stephen King is telling his audience to be paying attention to the thematic implications of this tale I'm about to tell within my tale.
I think you're right.
It's so smart.
Yep.
So we got to talk about the story that Peavy tells, because Peavy tells the story of Stephen Deshane kind of coming into town because the town is having a problem with a gang of men called the Crows. The Crows are kidnapping women, horribly violating them, and then selling them for ransom. And Stephen Deshane comes into town to help deal with this, and he meets up with the local sheriff and all his men, and they don't listen to Stephen's advice, and they decide to go for a headlong attack. Stephen waits back. Peavy chooses to stay with him, and they're the only two that survive, and they get to ambush these men. So it's a pretty important story about the badassness of Stephen Deshane.
Yeah, it is a great story. I guess there are a few things about the story that I wanted to point out. I guess before we actually get into the story, I wanted to point out that he does get shot, which is not something that Roland would ever allow to happen to himself. But
Roland is never shot in this in 7 books. He gets his hands mutilated. He's never shot. No one ever hits him.
No, it would almost be like a betrayal if Roland were to be shot, because you're like, but this is the one thing that we are just allowing him to be perfect at. It's sort of his curse, actually. But it's just interesting that Stephen Deshane is not on that level, apparently, or at least he wasn't when he was young. Maybe he's an ultimate badass now. But I guess I was just kind of surprised to see, he got shot. Interesting.
And it's interesting because it's not like the guy got a beat on him, he like fires widely and the shot ricochets off something and buries itself into his arm. So it's kind of like a fluke too.
Yeah.
It's Ka is not as friendly to Stephen Deshane.
Yeah. Ka's not protecting him. Yeah.
Yeah. I love this part though. This is right when they've got into the place where the men are holed up. The gunslinger crept inside and I right after him. They was all lying around snoring like dogs. Hell, boys, they were dogs. Belinda Doolin was tied around a post. She saw us and her eyes widened. Stephen Deshane pointed to her, then to himself, then cupped his hands together, then pointed to her again. You're safe, he meant. I never forgot the look of gratitude in her face as she nodded to him that she understood. You're safe. That's the world we grew up in, young men. That's the one almost gone now. This is so wonderful and so important. I think like this idea, this general idea that permeates both the story in particular and the Dark Tower as a whole, that the good times are over. The world has moved on. It's only bad times now, and it's going to get worse. That the people, the gunslingers, the knights of Eld that could ride around the countryside guaranteeing safety are all but gone. And I think this moment of sadness about this is really punctuated by, after the sheriff finishes telling the story, he basically says, once we've done this whole Skin Man thing, I'm done. I'm retired. I'm done with this whole thing. And is there going to be someone here to take my place? No, there's probably just going to be no sheriff anymore. And then in a couple of years, the mine will play out, and then all the miners will leave, and then the town will just fade away, will just disappear. This place will cease to exist, and everyone in it will cease to exist, and everything it represents will cease to exist. And that's just what life is in Midworld. That's just what existence is at this point. And it's heartbreaking, really.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking. And I think the story is reminding us of that very specifically. And, you know, I think showing us very vividly something that we haven't really seen much of, which is, what does Midworld look like when it's like midway through moving on? You know, I think we've seen some glimpses of like Magus was almost like too perfect. Like it was really before things started to really collapse. Yeah. And it had also kind of been spared. We got the sense that it had been spared the decay other places had experienced. And then in the story proper, they're walking through what is basically a post-apocalypse. But this is a town where, you know, within this man's lifetime, it went from a good place to live into being a wasteland. And you can really feel it, because I mean, we already kind of like this character, so him telling the story does make us sad.
Yeah, I mean, he's definitely the No Country for Old Men sheriff, right? Where he doesn't know what to do in a world that's like this anymore.
Yeah, or the seven cop.
Sure,
Morgan Freeman.
Sure. Yeah, and I mean, I think this is important because part of the reason we understand that Stephen Deshane is sending Roland out here is not because he actually believes a Skin Man is here. He actually doesn't, right? It's textually Van A is the one who believes that there might actually be a Skin Man out here. Stephen Deshane is like, nah, probably not. But to Stephen, it's not whether there's a Skin Man out here or not. It's that regardless of what's happening out here, it is an affront to civilization. It is an affront to our way of life. It is an affront to everything that the line of gunslingers stand for. And if we don't respond to things like this, then we're meaningless. Mm-hmm. And everything's already over. And I think that's really, really important, because that seems like it's something that's the most important to Stephen here. That we have to respond to things like this. We have to do the right thing here. And I mean, it's tragic in a way, because one of the things that Stephen says to Roland before he goes is, do that. We need you to do that. You have to do that, but hurry back, because I want you to be here before the fall. Because he kind of, it's like the writing's on the wall already. Like, this is inevitable, but we still, even as things fall, we need to remind people who we are and what we do and why that's important.
Yeah. I think that one moment in the bit you just read that was very important and speaks to that is when Stephen Deshane goes into this, you know, this room where all of these gangsters are sleeping, and he takes the time and he takes the effort to communicate non-verbally with the woman, tell her that she's safe and she's cared for. And like that actually strikes me as kind of unlike the cold asshole that we just had a conversation with. And it's like, oh, is this more the sort of thing that young Stephen Deshane would have done to go out of his way to comfort the woman? I think it might be partially the fact that he was younger and maybe had a bit more romanticism about him, or just a bit more empathy about him. But it could also be what you just said, this idea that like you're showing the flag. That's part of what you're doing. That's you're representing. You're not just doing a job. You're representing what it is to be a gunslinger. You're representing justice and the idea of peace and safety in the world.
Yeah. And look what it does, right? It not only does it in the moment just makes this woman feel better, it has left an imprint on this man, Hugh Peavy, this man who is kind of the last representation of good in the area. He has never forgot. He says right here, I never forgot the look of gratitude on her face. Stephen did that for him. And I mean, later, like when Roland actually gives him the bullet, he looks at that with this look of honor. This was a defining moment in his life. This is the moment that defined what kind of person he was going to be for the rest of his life. I think he says to Roland in this moment that I was about your age when I did all this. So I was at this very important defining moment of my life. And this interaction with Stephen Deshane helped form who I am. And that's the power of these knights, these knights of the white, the line of El, this important, chivalrous, amazing, kind gunslinger line, and why it has been so successful. And it's kind of a bummer to see that is dying here.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think I really like the idea that like young Stephen might have actually been more empathetic than old Stephen is, because like it reminds me of the archetype of the detective across like all detective fiction, where you have your detective character is very often driven to be a detective, to do this hard job out of empathy, out of a desire to get justice for people who have been wronged, or save people who are in danger. And then the flip side of the detective trope is, but because they have so much empathy and because they're so kind of sensitive in the Sherlock Holmes sense, the job wears at them, and having to deal with murderers and see dead bodies and learn about all these horrible situations, it wears at them, and they become alcoholics or they have all kinds of other life problems. And so that to me is sort of what a gunslinger is in this world, is like, or at least what Roland and Stephen are. I think. I know I'm right about Roland. I don't know if I'm right about Stephen, but I think these are men who, they have a romantic streak. They have a streak of empathy and humanity, but that streak is kind of beaten down by the fact that their job is to shoot people, and often fail to save other people from getting shot.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting. I agree with you there. I mean, we don't get to see a lot of Stephen to really drive home whether this is true or not, but it certainly seems like it. I mean, I do wonder. I think Stephen of today would have handled that situation different than it was. I mean, it does stick out as a wholly unnecessary thing to do. It didn't help them. It's not like we don't get told that he comforted her so she wouldn't scream, because if she screamed, that would spoil their ambush. Because like the next thing he does is shout at them and say, "All right, Crow boys, it's time to die." Like it had nothing to do with success in the mission. It was just, I see this woman, she sees me and looks at me as more trouble, and I'm going to take the power I have to make her feel a little bit better in this moment.
Yeah.
To feel a little bit more safe, that this is my duty. And he does it. Yeah. It's very powerful. So they finish the story, and the sheriff draws a map on the chalk wall of the cell and marks out all the places that have been attacked. And Jamie DeCurry, the smart whip he is, realizes pretty quickly that where the attacks happened, it seems to indicate that the Skin Man is a salty, which is what they call one of the miners working up in the mine, living up in that mining town. And so they've kind of narrowed down their suspects a little bit. There are over 200 men working up there, so they've got their suspects down to 200. Yay.
Great.
And then Roland asks the sheriff three pretty important questions. When we trooped back into the office, I said, "I have some questions I must ask you, Sheriff. The first is, will you open to us if we open to you? The second, The second is, do I see you for what you are and accept what you do? The third is, do I seek aid and succor? Sheriff Peavy says, yar, yar, and yar. Now, for God's sake, get your brain to working, fellows. I love this moment so much. And this is one of those moments where I have to, again, very respectfully, disagree with Cy King himself about the order these books should be read in, because I think this moment is so obviously written so that the individual reading it has knowledge of the questions from Wolves of the Calla. I don't think this scene works as well if this is the first time you learn about the questions. And I think the designed casualness by which the questions are both asked and answered here actually undercuts the buildup that Stephen does in Wolves of the Calla over the course of, dozens of pages to get to the moment where Roland finally asks 3 questions and they're finally accepted. And it's this extremely important, powerful moment in Calabrian Sturgis. I think this would take away from that a little bit here if you read this first. I really do.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, this is a much more fun contrast, knowing how, carefully Roland treats those questions in Wolves of the Calla. The older, more mature Roland, he understands the gravity of them. He understands the consequences that will follow. Whereas this young, inexperienced Roland, he acts like he's getting the guy to sign a waiver before he fumigates his house. It's just very perfunctory.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I do. I love that we get to see that contrast. I think it is really great, and it shows. I don't know, maybe like as the line of knights is failing, that the majesty of the things that they do has kind of lost its glamour a little bit, and so the power of the words just don't mean as much anymore. Whereas back in Wolves of the Calla, it's been 200 years. The line of gunslingers has been assumed to be gone. And then a gunslinger walks into town. And so suddenly these words that were so rote because we did them day in and day out every day for thousands of years, suddenly they take on new meaning because they represent something we thought was gone is still here. That's a really great contrast, I think.
Yeah, that's cool.
All right. So our gunslingers go to sleep and wake up the next morning to the phone ringing because it's the Dark Tower. Uh-huh. And that's what happens. You're in an Old West story and then the phone's ringing. Uh-huh. On the other line is someone named Canfield over at the Jefferson farm. There's been another attack and everyone there is dead. So they head up to the Jefferson ranch and, well, it's about to get pretty gross, Matt. But before it gets gross, I want to call attention to how King is himself calling attention to Roland's youth in these moments. Like, as he's walked into town and walked to help out, and as he approaches each new people, we get this moment where they see his guns first and are like, fuck yeah, and then see his face and realize how young he is and get disappointed. And then we get these moments where he's like, we're kind of learning about what a pokey and a proddy is, and Roland kind of messes up which one Canfield is. And then there's this moment where Canfield is explaining why he got back to the ranch house first. He said, being a proddy, I got back to the ranch house first. And Roland is like, what? I don't understand. What do you mean? And he's like, well, obviously I've got a nice horse because I got a ranch horse, where as the pokies, the unattached cowboys, they just got their own mules and shitty stuff. So they were slower to get back. And it's really accentuating that Roland's immature, a little bit ignorant and inexperienced, and these are hard men that have lived hard lives. And here's the young, soft as a peach Roland coming in, which isn't entirely true because like Roland's a badass, right? But the type of life he's lived is so different from these men.
Yeah, I mean, he is not like what they did in Magus, I think, is a good thing to compare it to, because did they blow away like 80 men?
Yeah,
they did. But also they got completely owned on like the tactical, the game of castles that he played with bad guy, man.
Jonas.
He basically lost the game of castles. He had his ace in the hole, which is probably a part of the game Castles, which was Susan freeing them from prison and then giving them the opportunity to get the drop on them and shoot them in the back, basically.
Sure.
So anyway, the point is, Roland did not acquit himself very well in the intellectual game, and yet again, he's just young. He's just not worldly. He doesn't understand these things. So sending this guy in to shoot a bunch of people, good, great decision. Sending him in to be a detective, I don't know if that's going to work out.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing we'll say about Jamie DeCurry is he seems to be a pretty good detective. So at least he's got Jamie.
Yeah. I mean, that's what's kind of funny is that this is already violating our expectations of Jamie, because we sort of thought of Jamie as being dumb and slow and plotting. And it's like, well, maybe he's just quiet.
Yeah.
He's putting it all together in his head. Yeah.
I mean, it is interesting because like Jamie also serves at several times throughout the story as like being the person who can ask the dumb question so the audience understands it.
Mm-hmm.
Like King has him several times say like, what does that mean? And then Roland explains to Jamie.
Mm-hmm.
But then, I mean, on the flip side, there's the moment where Stephen tells Roland that the women prefer the diddle stick to men, and he has no idea what it means. And he asks Jamie, and Jamie's like, you seriously, you don't know what that means? Like, so it's really interesting, right? Like,
yeah.
I do. I think Jamie's a little smarter than we're getting him credit for. He's just very quiet. And so he comes off as kind of the dumb, quiet one, but he's smart.
Yeah. I mean, I like the idea that these are two young men who are both basically fundamentally competent and have good minds, but they're so young that they're sort of just piecing together the world from fragments of sugar packets that they pick up off the ground. And like that. It's very relatable actually because I think when you're about this age, because remember, like Roland, he was like 14 in Wizarding Glass, so he can't be much older than that now.
Yeah.
And that's an age where you just don't know what the fuck's going on. You know, you're desperately trying to put things together from little bits of hearsay, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we have Google now, but just imagine what it was like before that. I mean,
wait a minute, Roland doesn't have Google?
We didn't have Google when we were 14.
What would the Midworld version of Google be called? Because I feel like Google's already kind of a silly Midworld word for it.
Yeah, it would have an ooh sound in it for sure. Because companies with an ooh sound in the name are the best kind of companies.
Yes, I agree. Doof Media.
Uh-huh.
We're so smart. So smart.
That was a good move.
All right, let's deal with what happened here, Matt. I don't want to, but let's deal with it.
Okay.
It seems, based on the tracks, that a giant fucking bear that's not Shardik came through and absolutely ravaged Jefferson Ranch. He started in the bunkhouse, then moved on into the big house, killing everyone, including the rancher's wife and daughters. There's two of them. They're both dead. The brutality here is, for lack of a better word, extremely brutal.
Uh-huh.
It's as if both Roland and King understand that in order to really buy into the story that's being told here, we have to really understand what this thing is, not just through stories told by witnesses, but by actually witnessing it ourselves. And with that in mind, I'm going to read this passage here. The thing had turned the bunkhouse into an abattoir. In the end, the butcher's bill came to 16 proddies, the cook who had died beside his stove with his rent and bloodstained apron thrown over his face like a shroud, and Jefferson himself, who had been torn limbless. His severed head stared up at the rafters with a fearful grin that showed only his top teeth. The skinman had ripped the rancher's lower jaw right out of his mouth. Kellen Fry found it under a bunk. One of the men had tried to defend himself with a saddle, using it as a shield, but it had done him no good. The thing had torn it in half with its claws. The unfortunate cowboy was still holding on to the pommel with one hand. He had no face. The thing had eaten it off his skull.
Uh-huh.
Oh boy.
Yeah. I mean, there's the horror. Mm-hmm. And this, you know, the way this is told, it really dwells in the terribleness of it. It really invites you to vividly imagine what this must have been like, right? Like,
sure,
King doesn't tell us the story, but he kind of walks us through the crime scene, as it were, in a way where you're sort of forced to imagine these things happening. You know, that killed this guy, ripped this guy limb from limb, tore his head off, and ripped his jaw off. And then we're seeing throughout all this, we're seeing the characters' reactions. We're seeing them, you know, come to the verge of vomiting in some cases. And that also, you know, just it activates the mirror neurons, right? It kind of gets you thinking like, oh yeah, this, I see characters I care about reacting as if this is horrible, so that makes me feel it even more.
Yeah, if this was like a detective movie, we would probably have the detective walking around the bunkhouse and then like doing this interstitial cutting of like scenes of the carnage. But we can't do that in a book, and yet that feeling is still generated.
Yeah.
It's really great.
Yeah, and all the other cops who aren't the detective would be like, putting their hand to their mouth, in that way that they do in movies.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's really important that we establish just how horrible this thing is, right? I mean, Jamie DeCurry's reaction here is basically, Roland, we have to get this thing. Like, he looks at what was done here, and there is a certain cruelty to it, and it's like, it's not just a thing doing it because it's hungry, right? Like, he didn't just eat. He ate the face off the skull of a cow for no reason other than to do it. Like, I think the detail of the rancher's lower jaw, like being under a bunk, like it moved so far away.
Yeah.
This thing is just being brutal and mean to do it. It's enjoying it for some reason.
Yeah. I mean, as I was reading this, I was automatically putting on the hat that I wear when we're reading like a ton of French murder mystery novel and like trying to profile, like, okay, I feel like this skin man, whoever he is, probably knows these people, or at least he has some kind of maybe some sort of like class resentment toward the landowner guy here, because like he absolutely demolishes the rancher. Everybody else he kills, of course, but it's the man in charge that he rips limb from limb and just brutalizes in that particular way. And so I was wondering, like, okay, well, is this like revenge? Is this resentment? Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure which or what exactly yet, but I think we're definitely meant to notice that, like you said, he's relishing the violence of it.
Yeah. So Jamie and Roland follow the tracks out into the hills near the ranch, and they see those tracks transform several times until they turn back into a man. And then they notice that this man gets on a horse and rides away, which basically means that the skin man knows what he is. He knows he's some sort of werewolf, and he's doing what he's doing consciously, which exactly links up to that feeling you were talking about just a moment ago. It also means, conveniently, that their 200 suspect list just got whittled down to a much smaller number, because those that work in a mine probably don't either own or know how to ride a horse. That seems rare for a person in this world that is a miner. So they limit their suspects down here, which makes you feel a little bit good. And I love this because I think King is, as you talked about, playing in the detective mystery novel type thing here. And it's very interesting because the 2010s sees King kind of diving into mystery stories in a way he hasn't in his previous career. I mean, there's a real intensity to the focus he puts on this kind of storytelling in this decade. I mean, the biggest example of that is the Bill Hodges trilogy, which is basically just supernatural detective stories. That's what they are. He also released The Outsider, which is a continuation on that. He also released a short story in If It Bleeds, a short story collection that came out last year that has a story in that continues this. So it's a thing he's really getting into in this decade, and this feels like an early example. 2012, him just kind of fooling around with the genre like he's never before.
Cool.
It's cool.
Yeah. No, I mean, I love it. It's one of my favorite genres.
We're gonna have to do Bill Hodges Slingers.
Okay, fine.
So just as they plan to move out, Roland and Jamie hear a groan and discover poor little Bill Streeter, who may be anywhere from 9 to 11 years old, but let's just call him Jake aged because that's what he's supposed to be. He's supposed to be Jake aged.
Yeah. That definitely seems intentional. And yeah, I mean, and also it helped me to remember that Roland is not that much older.
Yeah.
Which I think plays into things. It plays into the kind of callous way in which he treats this boy.
Oh, sure. 100%. I think it's really important. I mean, Bill is pretty important to the story because he's kind of the impetus for us getting into the story within the story. But we find out that Bill has survived because he heard noises and hid in this little hut that they're in, hide under little scraps of leather. His father is the cook. And so we know he's dead. So
yep,
it's rough. Speaking of his death, I love this moment here. I tried to say what needed saying and couldn't. You have to remember that although Jamie and I wore guns, they weren't yet the big guns of our fathers. I'd never again be so young as before I met Susan Delgado and loved her and lost her. but I was still too young to tell this boy that his father had been torn to pieces by a monster. So I looked to Sheriff Peavy. I looked to the grown-up. I adore this, Matt. I adore this moment. It ties into just what you were saying about reminding ourselves that Roland himself is still young. And I think it's also something very unique to this method of storytelling, that because this is old Roland telling a story of when he was young, he can put these things in here that if this story was told in third person, we would have either had to do a parenthetical or we would have just not included this at all. Mm-hmm. Because I don't think young Roland admits in this moment why he couldn't say the words. Mm-hmm. I think he just obfuscates and kind of walks away.
Yeah.
And I think this is very clearly an older, wiser old man who recognizes why he behaved a certain way when he was a kid.
Yeah, right. And I mean, I very much doubt that young Roland is even aware of it. And also just to remember, like he is currently struggling with the grief over having lost his own mother in a very complicated situation. And here is a boy who has just lost his father, and Roland doesn't know what to do with it. Like he doesn't really know how to be there for this kid. I mean, he's relatively cold actually. And I mean, we'll see all the stuff that he does to this kid.
Yeah.
We'll talk about that when we get there. But yeah, no, he's just not equipped to deal with this, I think.
I mean, he's never been taught how to, mm-hmm. Right? I think you're totally right that this compares to his own grief that he's going through. I really love the touch of I looked to the grown up. The use of the word grown up there is so good because like that's something a kid would say. Like right. I don't think adults call themselves grown ups. I think kids call them grown ups.
Right.
And that's a great word usage that really just seals the youth of the paragraph.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we learn here, Matt, that Roland has come up with a plan. He's going to send Jamie up to the mine encampment and start getting a group of people who know how to ride and own a horse down to basically be put in front of a lineup. They're going to be brought into town for questioning, but that's not all he's doing. He's going to pull a cozy. He's going to use Little Bill as bait. And I love this paragraph here. And one other thing, you're going to pull a cozy, and Kellen's son Vika will be your cat's paw. They'll believe a kid might run off at the mouth, even if he's been told not to, especially if he's been told not to. Jamie waited, but I felt sure he knew what I was going to say, for his eyes were troubled. It was a thing he'd never have done himself, even if he'd thought of it, which is why my father had put me in charge. Not because I'd done well in Magus. I hadn't, not really, and not because I was his son, either. Although, in a way, I suppose that was it. My mind was like his. Cold.
Uh-huh.
Another thing that only in retrospect can adult Roland see exactly the truth of all this, that his friend would never do this, and he, of course, it would be the first thing he would think of.
The first thing he would think of would be sacrifice the kid. That's our Roland.
Yep, that's our guy. Hooray. So that the plan is basically to let on to the skin man that there's a kid in town who's seen him, and then put them in a room together and see what happens.
Oh, Jesus
it's
Christ.
Amazing. Yeah. It's so amazing that the first plan Roland always comes up with is, how can I throw a human being at the problem? If there's a way to throw a human at the problem, that's going to be the first thing I think of.
Yeah. Oh, I'm out of eggs. Is there any way I can sacrifice any of my family members to get eggs? Yeah.
I really want to see a situation in which, like, what would that look like? Write that story, Matt.
Yeah, okay, I will.
Roland bakes a cake.
Yeah, Roland bakes a cake and kills 12 people. Yeah.
Doesn't a baker's doesn't.
Yeah.
Oh my God, it's so good. So while Jamie is up in the mine, Roland is going to take Bill back into town himself, and on the way he's going to be using his little hypnotizing trick with his bullet to see if Bill remembers anything about the encounter. And we have to spend some time on this, Matt, because it's amazing in how cruel it is. Like he takes him to this hut, he starts hypnotizing him, forcing him not just to remember the night before that he has seemingly pushed out of his mind due to trauma. Not just recall it, but to relive it. The magic of the hypnotism trick takes him to the now way of remembering, Roland says. He had gone back to the now way of remembering, and his words came more slowly. They were broken by bursts of weeping. I knew it was hurting him. Remembering terrible things always hurts, but I pressed on. I had to, for what happened in that abandoned hostelry was the important part, and young Bill was the only one who had been there. So again, he's hung out with this kid for 10 minutes, and he signs him up to be bait and then tortures him with trauma.
Yep. It's pretty remarkable.
Isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, at this point you have to wonder, like, are the Ka-tet members just like looking at each other like, what the fuck?
I think they're just used to it.
Yeah, they're just like, yeah, that's about right.
I mean, I think the important thing is here, Roland is telling this with a certain level of awareness. I think the story frames this act as if Roland maybe didn't at the time, but certainly knows now how fucked up this is. Like, I think he's aware enough to know that for sure.
Yeah, well, he's emphasizing that he's done it, right? Like he's choosing what to include in the story, right?
Yeah.
And this is clearly he's focusing in on how badly he treats this kid. Yes, totally,
definitely. He does get at least some important information here, Matt. We get another little clue. The skin man had a blue tattoo ringing around his ankle. So another clue. Hooray. Torture works.
Yay. Yeah, I mean, but yeah, no, it's such a teenager-y thing to do. If you have this hypnotism power, you're just going to be like, well, I'm going to use it on the kid. Just going to do that.
Yep. So they finally get back into town, and Roland storms into the sheriff's office in a mood. The two sheriff's deputies try to tell him what he can and can't do, and Roland basically tells them to fuck off. It's kind of amazing a little bit. Like, he's very young, and these people treat him as if he's very young, but like, he feels comfortable dealing with assholes in this manner. And like, I love this quote right here. "Go now," I said. "The boy needs rest. They looked me up and down, then went, which was the correct thing. The only thing, really. My mood was not good."
I mean, yeah, we're allowed to notice that Roland is a badass. That's he is.
Yeah, definitely. Then he heads to the blacksmith to get something made. We don't. The text actually kind of hides from us what he's doing. He hands over a bullet, and they're talking about like how much power the gunpowder will explode at. So any guesses on what he's getting made here?
I figured it would be a silver bullet. Hopefully more than one silver bullet, because I would always prefer to have more than one in this situation.
So you're going with the very classic werewolf story.
I figure King would do something like that. I mean, if it's not a silver bullet, it's some kind of magic bullet, right? It's some kind of special bullet.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, we will find out.
Yeah.
So Roland goes back to the police station, for lack of a better word, the jail, and learns from the two shitty deputies, which were, by the way, we're told from PB that these are like his shittiest deputies. So textually, they're not like great people. But they do tell him that the blue ankle tattoos are marks of prisoners from an old prison that has now been abandoned and overrun by Farson and his men. So the clue that we got, it's not like a unique tattoo. There's a chance that many of these miners will have this tattoo, because probably people that are working in mines, some are going to be some ex-cons at least. Yeah. So it doesn't totally knock our list of suspects down to one, but smaller.
It's a bad wrinkle in the plan, right? It's
sure
like Roland kind of thought that he would have some awareness of like, okay, this is probably our guy because he's got the tattoo, and now he realizes, oh crap, I can't really narrow it down that much, and the situation is not quite as under control as he thought it was. So that makes us nervous.
I mean, what he says when he hears about the tattoo, he kind of jumps the gun a little bit, and like he whispers to himself, "We just caught you, Psy Skin Man, and you don't even know it yet," right?
Yeah.
Which is a little overconfident, as we learn, because it's not a perfect unique thing to indicate someone off of.
Right.
And then we get this part, which this is basically the last thing we're going to talk about this week, but I wanted to conclude on it because I do think it's really important. We don't get much help from Gilead these days. Not apt to get more from John Farson. And there's some that send a parlay party west to ask him. Perhaps they saw something in my eyes, because he sat up a little straighter in his chair and said, "Not me, of course. Never. I believe in the straight law and the line of eld." "So do we all," Pickens said, nodding vigorously. I love this part, and I think this is really important to a lot of what's going on in this story. We talked about how Roland kind of walked into the sheriff's office and was just an asshole to these two men, right? And they're not the sharpest tacks in the bunch, but there was no reason to not be nice to them. Like they hadn't done anything to him yet. They just kind of he walked in the sheriff's office and just immediately walked back to the prison like he owned the place. And he's a 16-year-old looking dude. And they're just like, "Hey, you can't do that." And I want to compare this to the way in which Stephen Deshane deals with the men of this town, because we see a story about young Stephen, and young Stephen walks into this town and he disagrees with the sheriff. And he says, "Sheriff, I think your plan is a bad plan. I don't think it's good, but it's your town and I will leave it up to you." And of course, it's the wrong decision, right? The sheriff dies and everyone that goes with him dies. But Stephen showed these men a level of respect as people in their station. And the result in that was Hugh Peavy becoming a gunslinger's man for life. And Roland kind of blows into town and he's rude to these people. And then we conclude on this line of these two men basically gesturing at the fact of John Farson is better than you. And I think it's so important that the thing that stops them from saying that is not respect for Roland and what he represents, but fear, right? Perhaps he saw something in my eyes. Yeah.
It's he's going to shoot him, and they're afraid of him. Absolutely. Yeah. And this all coming after Roland was sent on this mission by his father, where he was basically told, the point of this mission is to wave the flag. Yes, you're supposed to kill the skin man. You're supposed to show that we're still capable of helping, but you're supposed to do it in a way that makes people like you. That's part of the mission, I think. And I don't think young Roland is doing a good job on that. Yeah, I mean, we textually know that being a politician is part of being a gunslinger. And I think he's being a bad politician here. These two guys are jerks. I'm not saying they're not jerks, but even jerks sometimes need a little modicum of respect that's what a politician has to do. Sometimes you have to shake hands with assholes. You just got to do it. And Roland doesn't care to do it here. Right. And I think we are being shown this as a way of showing a difference between who Roland is and who Stephen not is, but was. Because I do think you're right that it is possible that Stephen Deshane is not like this anymore, and thusly has instructed his son in a way that is opposed to what he used to be. Yeah, I like that. Yeah. Cool. All right, so Roland goes back into the cell with Bill, and with nothing to do but kill time until Jamie returns and marches a possible skin man in front of a boy who can recognize him, which is not dangerous at all. He tries to distract him with card playing, but Bill wants a story instead, and Roland decides to tell him The Wind Through the Keyhole, the story that he's referenced a few times throughout this story. And so we end at the beginning of the next story, which we will be covering next week. All right. Sounds good. Unfortunately, Matt, this is going to be a little frustrating. I'm sorry, folks. This is going to be a pain in the ass. I don't know how to explain this in a way that makes it make easy sense. But next week, we're going to read half of The Wind Through the Keyhole. But that story is not broken up into sections. There are no chapters. There are no numbers. There are just page numbers. And they're just words. So here's what I can tell you. Matt, I hate this. I hate this so much. This is great. We are reading up to page 184 in the re-released version of the book, which is not going to be the same version if you have the original. I don't have that near me, so I can't give that to you. I can only give you words. So I hate this. Here's the deal, folks. You read up until the sentence, "In the barn, he asked Bitsy if she would like to go
for another evening ride. You hear that and you go, okay, we're done. If you hear the widow Smack was exhausted by her unaccustomed labors, stop. You went too far.
Okay.
And that's all I can do. I'm sorry. I hate it. I hate it so much.
Yeah. It's not the end of the world if anybody except me reads too far. So I'll just
That's true.
Just have to be careful.
That's true. But I mean, the story within a story within a story in this book is 155 pages. That's too many pages for us to cover in 1 week. These episodes are already too long to begin with. And if we do 155 pages, it's going to be 4 hours long. So I had to cut it up in half. And because they're doing like a fairy tale thing, there are no chapters, there are no sections, there are no subsections. It's just continuous story with paragraph breaks. That's all there is. That's all we have. So we have to do it this way. It's the only time we've had to do this, and it will be the only time we have to do this in the future. I'm sorry, I hate it, but that's the way it is. So blame Steven. It's not my fault.
I know. We can handle it. it.
All right. So that is it for this week. We do have a discussion question next week, and here it is. So now that we've met all three members of Roland's Ka-tet, which of those three men is your favorite? How does Jamie Redhand relate to Roland's future Tet? We've talked about the ways in which Cuthbert relates to Eddie, the ways in which Elaine relates to Jake. Is Jamie DeCurry a Susanna, or is he doing something else? And if so, what? I'm really curious what you folks come up with here.
Yeah, me too. And try not to inject information that I wouldn't know, obviously. But
yes, please.
But I'm interested in the character of Jamie.
Yeah. All right, that's it for us this week. Good luck remembering where to stop reading.
In the barn, he asked Bitsy if she would like to go for another evening ride. Okay, I got it.
In the barn, Bitsy, evening ride.
Yep. Remember, you can reach out to us at kingslingerspod@gmail.com or on Twitter at kingslingerspod, or you can head on over to the subreddit r/doofmedia, and you can answer the discussion question or just hang out there.
Yeah, lots of fun people over there chatting about all things Stephen King, all things stories. I guess we've talked about Redwall a lot because every time there's Redwall news, it gets posted there. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
If you're not already subscribed to Kingslingers, now is a great time to do it here at the very end of season 1, but the beginning of so much more. It's a great time to make sure you never miss an episode. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and pretty much anywhere else in the world. You can listen to those cool little things called podcasts.
That's right. And if you like any of our shows and you want to support them, then please consider donating to our Patreon account at patreon.com/doofmedia. This week, we are going to thank new Doof Dancer patron, Billy. Welcome to the community, Billy.
Yes, welcome, Billy. And make sure you vote in Game Club, because we have a Game Club coming up this Saturday. And so next month's game is being decided right now. And Billy and everyone else that supports us on Patreon can vote right now.
That's right.
But of course, if you cannot afford to donate to us right now, that is absolutely okay. You can always help us out by sharing this podcast with all of your Stephen King loving friends, family, enemies, pets, just whatever. And you can always help us out by leaving a rating and a review. This week's Spotlight review comes from Armored Sunday, who gives us 5 stars and says, "Great pod. I am a big fan of the Dark Tower series, and I'm so very excited to have recently found this intelligent and exploratory analysis of the books. With the point of view of both a constant reader and a first-time reader, there are no spoilers. It gives me all the feels of my first journey into the tower. Highly recommend." Well, thank you so much, Armored Sunday. We really appreciate that. And thank you to everyone who has taken the time to leave those ratings and reviews. We see that number go up each and every week, and it makes me happy inside and outside.
Me too.
All right, folks. We'll see you all back here next week as we read a nebulous amount of the next part of the book. Long days and pleasant nights.
And may you have twice the number.